This is the Enlisted Podcast, episode number 3 with Lieutenant Ken Armstrong, United States Coast Guard. The Battle of Guadalcanal started in 1942 and was the first battle in the Pacific. Coast Guardsmen at Guadalcanal manned many of the Higgins boats, which are used to transport Marines between ships and beaches. Signalman Douglas Monroe led the boats that delivered Marines, including young Chusty Puller, a Marine who would later become a general and one of the most famous and respected Marines in the history of the Corps, to undertake a mission behind enemy lines. After Marines called in that they were being ambushed by Japanese forces and sustaining heavy casualties, Monroe volunteered to lead the flotilla back to extract them. He successfully removed all Marines, including the wounded, off the beaches. Monroe covered the last of the boats as they were leaving suppressive machine gun fire from his landing craft, and he was killed by enemy sniper. Dyson described his legacy to the embodiment of the Coast Guard's core values, which are honor, respect, and devotion to duty. And speaking of honor, respect, and devotion to duty, I have with me today Lieutenant Ken Armstrong, United States Coast Guard, who was a Chief Petty Officer, E7, and he reached that rank within 6 years, and then he went and became an officer and was out of service as a lieutenant, and he's here to join me today. Ken, how are you, buddy?
Hey, Kevin, it's awfully good to see you, my friend.
It's been a while. It definitely has been a while. But first, what led you to join? You have all these services, all these branches, the Navy, Marine Corps, Army. You hear a lot about them. What really got you interested in the Coast Guard, and what led you to that decision?
Well, I have to say I've never done the easy thing in life, and a lot of people would tell you I've never done the smart thing in life. So I don't know about the path that I chose to follow. But I had been working up on the pipeline in Alaska, and I came back down to the lower 48 when they buttoned up the job on the pipeline. And I went from making, I don't even remember, like $600 or $700 a week up there when that was big money, to making, a couple, I think I was making like $500 a month in the lower 48. And I went to lunch with a friend from the pipeline. We went to Marina del Rey in California, and we were sitting there at a restaurant called Pieces of Eight, looking out over the marina. And Waldo, my buddy, said, "Hey, I think the Coast Guard is hiring these days. We just expanded our territorial seas, and I'm sure they're looking for people." I didn't know the Coast Guard from the lifeguard on the beach. I knew nothing about him, but I went and visited a Coast Guard recruiter, got really hooked on the story of the Coast Guard, and 6 months later I was on active duty, and it was really as simple as that. Hey, I have to tell you, you told the story of Doug Monroe, who is the only Coast Guardman to be awarded the Medal of Honor, and Signalman Second Class Doug Monroe. When I went from being a permanent enlisted person to a permanent officer, when I think it was when I made lieutenant, they did that. Anyway, I took my oath of commission in front of the portrait of Doug Monroe, and I wish I could just pop it up on the screen, but I do have a photo of taking my oath in front of the portrait of Doug Monroe. So really meaningful history there.
And I think a lot of people, when they hear the Coast Guard, they think it's maybe a safer option if you're looking to not get into too much conflict. When you join in the military service, you think maybe, but they spend a lot of time overseas and a lot of time involved in combat situations, and they have a history of being in some pretty hairy situations. Did you think the same thing when you first joined? Did you think that there was a little bit less involvement?
I thought I was going to be hanging around the beach in little bitty, 40-foot boats or something like that, and pretty much taking it easy. I had no idea that the Coast Guard stretched around the globe, that we did. In many cases, they send Coast Guard into places where they don't send other people. So we have special operations people, and we have all kinds of stuff. And I had two bodyguard drivers in my last NATO assignment who were actually what they call riverine forces. They were from special operations forces from working in South America, and these guys were working as my bodyguards. So we've got a lot of bizarre stuff going on with Coast Guard people.
Yeah, because I think most people see like the rescues. They do a lot of sea rescues. That is like what they are known for. They have people jumping out of helicopters, boats that capsize. They deal with a lot of the enforcement on the southern, outside of Florida, Cuba, with the narcotics enforcement. They don't. You wouldn't think that they are specialized in combat operations, but after reading that story, I had to share that at the beginning because I was amazed that I always thought to myself, did you really have that many people in the Navy to drive those boats that brought the Marines to the beaches? They probably had to, hey, takes up some of the Coast Guard's personnel and utilize them for that. And that was very interesting to know that they did that. And that story, he's a hero, and that's amazing. And I'm sure there's many, many others throughout the Coast Guard's history that fall into that category. And
Well, a little known piece of history, if you look at all of the films that you've seen or the photographs of the D-Day invasion at Normandy in France, um, almost every one of those Mike boats that hit the beach at Normandy was being driven by Coast Guard.
see,
So,
something that
we've
people
been
don't
active.
realize.
Yeah, yeah. It's just the American people don't really know what their government is doing, which is kind of the bad news. We
Right.
need
A
to
little
become much
scary.
more transparent. Yeah, we need to be more transparent in our government.
So, you enter the service, you do 6 years, and you reach the rank of chief petty officer. That is something. That's an E7. That is very. That's unheard of. I mean, 6 years is not a long. I mean, that usually takes people 12 years to reach an E7 rank. You reached it in half the time. Tell me a little bit of what you did to achieve that. What specifically did? How did you go about your work?
Yeah, well, my timing was good, and frankly, I just tested really well, and had some fabulous assignments working for admirals and people who could help to move me along. So it was partly my credit and partly just really excellent timing. But I went out of boot camp into the engine room of a tiny ship in Los Angeles, and I was a diesel mechanic. I I love being a mechanic. I love working with my hands, but being down below decks while the ship was underway, aside from the seasick aspect of it, I didn't get to see what was going on. Every day looked the same. It looked like standing between two engines in the engine room. And I wanted to know more about what was going on. So when I was given an opportunity to go to school to become, they call it a yeoman, which is not the same as a Navy yeoman, but sort of an administrative specialist, I I took that school just to get out of the engine room, and that just ended up being just the right thing. I went to San Francisco. I worked for an admiral there who became the commandant of the Coast Guard. Worked for a couple of other admirals who also became commandant, and that just helped my career. And like I say, just very fortunate timing.
Now, you did some. Well, first off, how did you get put into the officer program? How did you become an officer after doing your 6 years enlisted? What was like? I know how the Marine Corps you could do, a program that's where you go from enlisted to an officer, and you have to have college credits, and there's all this work to be done. What is it that the Coast Guard does for that?
It's all very similar. In fact, all five of the or six now with the Space Force, but the military operates under what's called for officers operates under what's called DOPMA, Defense Officers Personnel Management Act, and so we all have pretty similar regulations about how you promote officers and that kind of thing. In my case, at about 5 or 6 years of service, I'd been doing well. I had good marks. I had taken some tests, CLEP and SAT and what have you, and I'd scored really well on those. So I applied for officer candidate school. And my first time out, I just barely missed it. My second time, I just barely qualified, but I squeaked across the line, was accepted to officer candidate school, and went to that. Yeah, I think it was a 24-week program or something. Resident, it's like going through boot camp all over again, only tougher. And so I did that and graduated as an ensign.
After that, well, first off, when were you stationed in NATO? Was it after candidate school or before?
After officer candidate school, as in fact, I'd been an officer, I think about 5 years or so when I went to Italy the first time and commanded a little NATO base on the island of Lampedusa, which that base is
Sounds
gone.
terrible.
It,
Terrible. Being on an
oh,
Italian island.
it was so hard to take. I won't go into the more colorful details, but it was an island that went from about 1,500 people during the winter to several thousand tourists in the summertime. The beaches would be crowded with Italian tourists, and I got to tell you, Italian tourists are not ugly people, and it was not a bad time to be the NATO base commander over there. I really loved that assignment, and I loved the Italian people. I loved what I did there. It was work that I can be proud of. I was also the U.S. consul rep to the Pelagi Islands during that time, so I got to work with a lot of levels of people, and it was really nice.
During your time with NATO, you were involved, and like we said before, you wouldn't realize how many conflicts that the Coast Guard gets involved in overseas. You were involved in the Bosnian conflict, the Bosnian War, and also in the Second Gulf of Sidra incident, which before we got started, you gave me a little history lesson on that, and I would appreciate it if you discussed your leadership during that time.
That was an interesting event. So the first Gulf of Sidra was when the U.S. attacked Tripoli, Libya. I think that was around 1986, thereabouts. The second incident was in January of '89 when the U.S. Navy shot down 2 Libyan MiGs in the Gulf of Sidra. And so I was the closest NATO base and the closest U.S. base to that event when it happened, and I got a call on the STU line, the classified phone line from Navy intelligence in La Maddalena, warning me that that we had just shot down these 2 MiGs. Well, coincidentally, I had a logistics flight on deck, a Navy helicopter that brought all of our supplies in from Sicily, and he was on deck and he was just getting ready to take off. And so I sent a runner out to signal the helicopter to shut down and have the pilot come in to see me. And he was furious. He was so mad at me for wasting fuel, having him shut down. And he came in and he's, I won't repeat all of the things he said, but it was colorful. And he, you better have a very good reason for having me shut down this helicopter. And I said, well, we just shot down 2 Libyan MiGs 100 miles from here. And he said, that's a very good reason. So he calmed down pretty quickly. The helicopter crew stayed on deck. We became the focal point for several weeks. We had European press just like taking the island by siege to find out what was going on, what we had done. So that was kind of my 15 minutes of fame. I had a friend who was bureau chief for Associated Press up in the Vatican, and she said she saw my name flying across their messages all day, every day for a couple of weeks.
Now, how is that having to deal with the press when you're a commander and you're dealing with I mean, some pretty tough decision making, and they're hounding you for answers. How do you provide those answers to the press at a time like that? How do you deliver that?
Well, that was my first real experience with media relations. I went on actually to be a media relations officer for the Coast Guard, but I didn't have a lot of training at that time, so I was just kind of going by seat of the pants. Can't say that I handled it very well, but my policy has always been to be as open with people about what's going on as the law will allow me to be. There are things that I'm even to this day not allowed to talk about, and I just won't because I respect that. But to the maximum extent that I can, even maybe sort of singeing the edges of certain things to, um, I, I, I try to be as open as I can. And so we had press coming down and talking to me, and I took them around and showed them all of our electronics suites on the base and let them see what we were capable of doing. They thought that maybe we were guiding the operations in Tripoli. And we weren't, we were Loran and Omega and stuff like that. So, but I, just stayed open with them.
Yeah, transparency is a hard thing to do when you're in the service and when you're in the military because they don't want you telling them anything. Same thing with the police department. My time in the police department, anybody ever ask you a question, you say, call this number, one police plaza, ask for the lieutenant that's in charge. You don't get involved with the press, and they kind of beat it into your head, because they don't want bad publicity. So, and, a good example is that is a Marine officer who recently, put out his own personal opinion about how we exited Afghanistan, and they've been hammering him since. He was a colonel in the Marine Corps, and he had some uncolorful words to say about the exit. The exit happened way too late, and that's for sure. But like everything, we never learn our lesson. When, did you see a difference? And from when being an enlisted personnel to when you became an officer in the mindset of how enlisted people think compared to how an officer has to command. There's always that friction between the enlisted and the officer personnel because it's the lieutenant doesn't understand. He was never an enlisted guy. You being enlisted, how did that help you when you were commanding troops?
Well, one of the things is because I had been enlisted, I was wearing a good conduct medal on my chest. And enlisted people, they spot an officer with a good conduct. They know it. And so they know that you were one of them. And that can be good news or bad news because there are some officers who get their commission and they become total jerks. But it does give you some credibility. And the enlisted people knowing that you understand what it's like to be in their shoes really helps. You talked about the Marine Corps officer. There are laws that apply to officers that don't apply to enlisted people. It is against the law under the UCMJ for an officer to criticize the president. It's not illegal for enlisted people to do that. But the reason for that is that as military officers, we have access to things that could skew the power of government. And we saw in the January 6th insurrection, there's information coming out about military officers who may or may not have acted properly. We've got to be careful that we don't allow military officers to become involved in running the government because that can be a really, really bad thing. So even though we have a lot of power, even though we have a lot of authority, we also have a lot of restriction on how we're able to use that. And I think that's a good thing. And I think we always want it to be that way, that we have a separation between the civilian and the military branches of government. The civilians own the military, not the other way around. And I think it always needs to stay that way.
I think you make a good point, and that's something that I didn't realize is that the officers have a different, level of, how they have to follow the UCMJ a little bit differently. Um, Leaving and learning what you did in the service in the Coast Guard leadership. Obviously, you've been in a lot of leadership positions. You were with NATO. I have to pick your brain about what's going on currently over in the Ukraine crisis. Just real quick, if we could touch on the European mindset for their military personnel. They obviously think a lot differently than maybe the American service members are trained to think, and how they operate is different. We operate on a global scale. They basically do what they're supposed to do, protect their country. They sign up to serve and protect their territory and their homes from evil and danger. What the Russian government is doing is evil. They're invading their sovereign nation, their neighbors. Innocent people are getting killed. How do you think, given your experience over in Europe, the European allies, the NATO allies, are viewing it from their perspective?
Well, I know right now they're very nervous. Shades of the 1930s when Hitler annexed Austria and Hungary and Poland and the Anschluss. This looks a lot like that, and Europeans are obviously afraid of that. In terms of NATO, in terms of what NATO is doing, I think there's very good reason for NATO. I think looking out for your neighbors is an admirable thing. As a police officer, neighborhood watch is a good thing. You have actively engaged citizens looking out for each other, and I think that watching out for our allies in Europe is a good thing to do. I think it's become too military. I think it's become too hot. As a rules of engagement officer in the Bosnian War, the thing that I was most proud of was that my weapon systems never went hot. I think we're really we're more aggressive, I think, than is safe for the world right now, and we need to be very cautious about that. But having alliances, having partnerships where you're looking out for each other is a good thing, and I think the European nations want to know that Americans care about aggressors trying to take their sovereignty from them.
Yeah, I just I always would think that, because when I was deployed in Iraq, there was Polish military there. Spain had troops there. I always felt that their mindset was a little bit different than ours. Obviously, they didn't want to be there. Um, they didn't believe in what the conflict was. And as I got older, I learned a lot of lessons, and we could dive into a whole discussion about that. But they always had a different mindset about war in general. And I just felt like, given what's going on, maybe not soft is the word, but they haven't had to deal with something like this since World War II. Are they prepared really for people crossing the border with tanks?
No, they're not, and that's really kind of our fault, because we've big brothered the European nations to death. Italy had, I don't even know how many NATO bases we've got, active NATO bases in Italy right now, but from one end of the country to the other, Aviano Air Base and all of the other bases that we've had in Italy, all the way down to Sigonella in Sicily. So we've big brothered them to the point where they haven't had the need, and in some cases haven't had the opportunity, to provide for their own defense. And then and Ukraine is not a NATO nation per se, but they're asking us for our support, and we don't want to get involved in a direct conflict with Russia, so we're having to be very careful how we support them. And the countries that are NATO countries nearby are very concerned about what that means to them. Poland, for example, is very concerned about what that means to them.
I always admire the perspective of somebody who's actually had skin in the game. I mean, you've been over there, you served with NATO, you've been in the military service, you've served in this country's Coast Guard, and the people that you always hear on TV that are giving their opinions on this never had skin in the game. So I do appreciate your perspective. Being, think about it. Everyone's always got something to say or tweet, and 95% of them never had skin in the game. So I do appreciate that perspective. Now, your time, obviously, with the Coast Guard and being an officer and being with NATO, leadership is a big part of your job. You transitioned into the civilian world, into a leadership position. Tell me a little bit about your work with the Habitat for Humanity.
Yeah, so what happened was there was a reduction in force when I hit about 17 years of service. And so I got an honorable discharge rather than a retirement and went out into the public sector. And yeah, I had been volunteering with Habitat for Humanity for a few years following Hurricane Iniki in Hawaii. Um, and so I really had a strong sense of what Habitat did, and they offered me a job as executive director for the state of Hawaii and also for the two affiliates on Oahu. So I really wore three hats there, and took them to their first $1 million budget on Oahu and built a bunch of houses. And um, can't say, that model, uh, helping people help themselves rather than just giving people a bunch of cash and letting them spend it. Helping people help themselves is a terrific model for engaging society and improving situations.
You mean just don't hand people cash and hope that they spend it appropriately? Is that what you're suggesting? That's just crazy talk, don't you know?
Hey, I mean, if you want to give me a stimulus check, as opposed as I am to taxes, if the government gives me money, I'm going to spend it, and that's what
Oh,
everyone does. If the government gives
I'm
you
owed
money,
it.
you spend
We're owed
it.
that money. They take too much.
I didn't feel bad about it. You got that right.
Yeah. So your work with Habitat Humanity, then you do work in Mexico with a Christian missionary. How did you get involved in that? That seemed like we're going from Hawaii to Mexico. Tell me about that.
There was actually a lot of Oregon in between, and I had pastored a congregation in Oregon and done a lot of ministry work there. And a friend asked me to come down to Mexico for a few weeks, and way down into Mexico. If I'd gone any farther into Mexico, I would have been heading out literally halfway through the country on Lake Chapala. And I just fell in love with Mexico, with the Mexican people. Um, it's not at all like the media paints it. It's a much different thing being down there. And so while I was down there, they offered me an opportunity to come back in a permanent position. It was definitely missionary style. It was not a get rich kind of thing. I've never taken a direct salary ever for ministry and don't want to. So I did get a little bit of financial help from people, um, but it was really all about working down there with the gringos who lived there and with the Mexican people, and it was wonderful.
How long did you spend down there? You spent quite a long time down there. And what was the main need for the people down in Mexico? What was given most?
So I was really actually only there for about 3 years, but um, one of the focuses of what we were doing down there was education. We were providing scholarships for high school students, little things like, it would cost them, I think it was the equivalent of about $1 a week to take the bus to school. And
Hmm.
so we were providing scholarships for kids to be able to take the bus to high school so that they could finish high school, and providing them the materials they need. In Mexico, students have to have uniforms, and poor people can't afford that. So we helped them out with that. So helping them with that. And then we got involved with a program with the state of Jalisco, which is the state that I lived in. They had um, a vocational education program, and so we helped get some students trained in culinary arts. We took a fund to get nursing students put through nursing assistant school, I guess it was. Um, and so providing education for the local people. They're fabulous people. They want to work. It's just that the opportunities have not historically existed. And when you can break the cycle of poverty for them, get them the education, man, they go gangbusters with it.
Now, we're going to be wrapping things up, but I got to ask you, because I know you, and we've done some work together in the past. Are you going to make an attempt to continue to serve in any capacity in the near future?
Well, you know that I ran in the 2020 campaign for the Libertarian nomination for president. That was exhausting and expensive. It was very financially um, costly to Dawn and me. Um, I would be willing to consider something like that again, but it would have to be something that had much more support than what we had in 2020. We were doing it pretty much out of pocket. So if I was going to do something again, I'm not trying to seed the thing, but uh, we would definitely need to have financial support behind us before we would move forward.
Yeah, it's a it is an exhausting process. What you did, you went by car, state to state, nonstop, just driving and meeting people and campaigning, and it said a lot about your work ethic. And from what we've discussed today with your time in service, your work ethic really paid off. I mean, E7 in 6 years, became an officer, served with NATO, commanded some major decisions during the time of crisis. I see where that work ethic came from. But I appreciate you coming on, and I appreciate your service, and I want to thank you for your service, as I do to everybody who comes on this podcast. You know, only a certain percentage of Americans do take an oath and enlist to serve and protect the country, or get involved in law enforcement, the fire department, all first responders, not just the military. It's selfish acts like that people put their lives on the lines to protect the rest of everybody else, and that's why I do this podcast. So I want to thank you for your service, Ken. And if anybody wants to follow you, Ken, where can they reach out to you?
Well, on Facebook, Wildfire CF, Wildfire CF is where you can find me on Facebook. And happy to hear from people. And I would say, Kevin, by the way, and I think you as a career police officer would agree, you don't have to do big stuff all the time. Just do stuff. Do good things in your community. That makes a difference.
Yes, and treat everybody with just respect, like everybody's a human being. That's all. We need a lot more of that in this world. And I want to thank you for what you've done. If you are listening to this podcast on the audio, please make sure you hit the subscribe button. Give us a rate, give us a comment. If you're on Apple Podcasts, give us a rating. It helps us get pushed up. If you're watching this on YouTube, hit that subscribe button. Give us a comment. Give us a thumbs up. We do appreciate it. And check us out on Facebook. Follow us on Facebook at Enlisted Podcast. And you can go to our website, enlistedproductions.com. We have a website up for any podcast that is produced by Enlisted, and this podcast itself. You could follow and search anything you want about this podcast. We do have a blog up as well. And this episode will also have a blog attached to it. So, Ken, I want to thank you again for coming on. I do appreciate your time. It is wonderful to see you. And, glad we made it out of this pandemic.
Yeah. Hey, man.
Yeah.
So much. It's been great seeing you.
Thanks, Ken.